So today we'll be going over functions and we'll be reviewing loops from last week, since I think loops were somewhat of a difficult concept. So we'll go over that again today to begin with, and then we'll go on to learning about some functions. And before we do that, I will put the link to the editor in the chat so that you guys can use that. All right, so just a reminder, what I put in the chat was the online compiler. And so that's what we'll be using to run all of our different programs. All right. And just a reminder, let's make sure that we are using the chat for class purposes. I know that last week that wasn't always the case, so I'd really like to be able to keep the chat up. All right, then let's get started. So last week we went over loops, and just a quick review of loops. Loops are basically just used in order to repeat different sections of code. It makes it a lot easier to repeat sections of code, since instead of saying something a certain amount of times, like copying and pasting our code multiple times, we just have to tell the code to run it until something runs out. So maybe we have a counter and we say, like, until our counter reaches the number 5, I want you to keep doing the loop. Or until our counter reaches a number that the user entered, I want you to keep doing our loop. And so that's a really easy way to set a certain amount of times you want something to happen. Or you can also set a loop to run while a condition is true. So maybe if you don't want to use a counter, you can do it like, say, if you have people ordering ice cream, you can have something run until they've ordered an ice cream that is like out of order or does not exist at the shop. And you could say stop running and let them like check out, or if they're done ordering their ice cream, or maybe let them try again. So we can also use these types of loops, loops that run while a condition is true, if we want to play again for a game. And we'll look at that a little bit more next week. But you could say something like, do you want to play again? Y or N for yes or no. And then if they select yes, and so you could, if they select yes, then you could have that loop continue while the condition or the value is Y, if that makes sense. And we did go over this a little bit last week, but and we will do it again today. But basically, you can have things run while something is true or while something is false, which is super helpful. So there are two main types of loops. We have our for loop, which is always used with a counter. And this is really helpful if you have a certain number of times you want to run your code. That's because we're always using a counter and we're always updating that counter. You also have the while loop. And the while loop runs while the condition is true. So if you wanted to, like I said earlier, make a game that maybe has a replay button or something like that. So let's just go over a quick review of our loops. So this is the for loop. And as I said earlier, we initialize our value first, our counter. So for example, a very common one is int I, and you'll often initialize it to 0 or 1, but that's not always the case. And then you have some sort of condition. So that's like for I is less than 5, or for I is less than the number of rows in a theater or something like that. And then you update your value of I. So you could say I plus plus, meaning that I increases by 1. You could say I minus minus, which means that I decreases by 1. Or you could do something different. So you could say something like I equals I plus 2. That would make I increase by 2 every time. So you can do a lot of different things to make I update, but the most common one we'll see is I plus plus. And so basically how the for loop works, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, so I'll just turn on the laser pointer. But for the for loop, what you start by doing is you initialize your variable. So in this case, I equals 1. Once we initialize it, we check if the condition is true. So in this case, is 1 less than or equal to 5? And in this case, 1 is less than or equal to 5, right? So that's true. Since it's true, we move on and do the code inside the brackets. So it's going to output I. Since I is 1, it's going to output 1. And then it's going to do a little space, and then it's going to come back up here and update. So now I will turn into 2 because it's 1 plus plus, so 1 plus 1 is 2. Then we don't initialize again. You only initialize one time, that's at the beginning. So once we increase by 1, we're going to jump back to our condition and check if that's true again. So is 2 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Then it's going to do the stuff in the brackets, and it's going to come back up here, update. And so this is sort of how the loop works. You can see it's physically a loop, like we're checking the condition. If it's true, we do the code, then we update, check. So it's sort of like a loop circle, which is really fascinating to see, just sort of all the things we can use it for. So this table does a really good job of visually showing you what is going on in the loop, because I know that they are a little bit confusing, like conceptually. So if what I was just saying doesn't really make sense, maybe this makes a little bit more sense. And I have a practice problem on the next page for you guys. So hopefully you're paying attention and know how to do this. But basically, as I said earlier, we check I is 1. We check if it's true, and then if it is, we print that value. Then I updates, we check if that's still true. If it's true, it prints. And that keeps happening until I is 5. Is 5 less than or equal to 5? Yes. So that's true. And then 5 is printed. And I is increased to 6, because that's how it updates. Now I is 6. So 6 is not less than or equal to 5, which means it's false. So the loop is terminated. And basically what that means is it stops doing the stuff in the brackets, and it moves on to any code if there is code below it. So now I'd like you guys to try that. This was a question that I had given as like an optional homework assignment, but I saw that many of you didn't do it, so I thought we could try it out in class. Hopefully this explanation made a little bit more sense. But I'd like you to try and figure out what is the message outputted by this code. And when you think you have it, you could just type your answer in the chat. Either just do it like a direct message to me with the number 1, 2, 3, or 4 as your option choice. So I'll just walk you guys through what it is, and then let me know what answer you think it is. 1, 2, 3, or 4. So we start by int x equals 0. While x is less than 3, it's going to output the message hi. And then x is going to increase by 1. So this is a little bit different than the previous loop. The previous loop was our for loop. That updated all up here. The while loop, for me at least, makes a little bit more sense. We have our condition up here, and this is our message, and then x increases or updates. So we have x is 0, it checks for the condition. While x is less than 3, then it does this message, and then x updates. And that keeps happening until this condition is false. Then it's going to come down here. It's going to check if this is true. If it is, then it's going to do this stuff. If it's false, then it's not going to do anything, and then the program is done. So take a look at that. We start with x equals 0. So is 0 less than 3? Yeah. So it's going to output hi. And then 0 is going to go plus plus, so now it's going to be 1. X is going to be 1. We come back up here and check if that's true. So how many times do we do that? And then do we output the word by? When you think you know, just put your answer in the chat. I'll give you a couple minutes. And if you have any questions, now would be a good time to ask. You could just message me in the chat. And even if you don't know, just feel free to guess. So we know that it can't be 1, right? Because 0 is less than 3, it outputs high. Now x is 1. 1 is less than 3, it's going to output high again. So we know it's at least going to output high twice. Does it keep outputting? I'll give you guys like 30 more seconds. I'd like to see an answer from everyone. All right, thank you guys for, thank you to those of you who did put an answer in the chat. It's always fun to see what you guys say. So it looks like everyone is split between numbers 3 and 4, which makes sense. When I first did this, I thought it was 4, and then I had to go again and check. So let's look at this. Oops, all right. So I sort of put it out in the table because, at least for me, I think it's easier to visualize in a table. So first we have our x value. X is initially 0 because we initialized it to 0. So is x less than 3? Yes, that's true. So it's going to output high. Now x increases by 1, and now x is 1. That's still true, so it outputs high, high. Then x is 2. That's also true, so it's going to output high, high, high. Since that was true, x is going to increase again to 3. Now x is 3, but this condition is for x is less than 3. So this loop is now false. So now it's going to jump down to the if statement. And since 3 is not equal to 4, it's not going to output the word by. So we end up outputting just the message hi, hi, hi. So thank you to you guys for trying that out. And I know that this can be a little confusing just with a lot of the coding, math, and logic. So if you're not completely getting it, that's okay. We can do a little bit more practice too. I can put them in the Google Classroom to try. Yeah. And if you have any questions, definitely ask in the chat. All right. So we went over for loops a little bit earlier, and this was a while loop practice. I don't know why I wrote for loop practice there, but we'll do one more while loop practice since those are super useful. So in this while loop practice, I'd like you guys to have a user enter integers, so basically numbers, to the computer. And then once the user enters the number 0, that basically means that they want to quit the program. So once they enter 0, I want the program to find the sum of all the integers they used. And I want you to use a loop. So basically, you're going to get numbers from a user, and then once the user enters 0, you're going to find the sum of all the integers and use a while loop. So I'll give you like 2 or 3 minutes to get started on that, and then I'll try it on my screen so you guys can see it. But the first step would be, I would recommend just creating that while loop and then seeing what values you want in here. So what is the condition? And then what is the user entering? And maybe what variable do you need? So you'd want an integer. All right, I'm going to start the problem on the right side of my screen. Sorry, the screen shouldn't. Let me know if you did it any differently. So to start, we're gonna, as a reminder, do IOStream. And I'll put the link for this in the chat for anyone who joined a little bit late. And we want to use namespace std or standard. So this is our main function. And we want the user to enter numbers to the computer. And these are integers. So first let's declare the variable. I'm going to call it int, and then I'm going to give the variable the name num for number. And we want this to keep happening. We want them to keep entering numbers. So we could say something like cout and enter a number. And that number is num. And we want them to use the number 0 to quit the program. So I could say something like, outside of my loop, I could say enter 0 to quit. And when do we want this to be true? So we want this to be true while num does not equal 0. Because we want this to keep asking for numbers while num does not equal 0. As soon as num equals 0, we want this to stop, we want the loop to stop, and we want it to output the sum. So that's why we're going to say not equals. Oops, I did that wrong actually. So exclamation mark and then an equal sign basically means not equals. So this should continue while the number does not equal 0. So let's declare our variable sum. And this is basically just going to get a number from the user multiple times. And then we want it to calculate the sum. So we could say the sum is the sum plus our number. And I'll just say the sum is 0 right now. And sometimes you'll have to declare or initialize your variables since it wants to check if it's not 0. So I'll just call num. Actually, we can see if this works like this. So let's try this. But basically what I'm saying is I'm declaring my two variables, and I'm telling them that they got to enter 0 to quit the program. This loop will keep asking for a number while the number does not equal 0, because as soon as they click 0, I want it to stop the loop and just calculate or output the sum. No. Sometimes you have to initialize. All right, enter a number. So it calculated the sum. It went 8 plus 9 is 17. So basically that's how we do this. We're going to continue this while the number does not equal 0, so that when we enter 0, it stops the loop, and then it just outputs this. And I can put this code in the chat for anyone who wants it. All right, so that's just a brief review of the while loops. So if anyone has any questions about loops, now would be a really good time to ask before we move on to learning about some functions. Sorry. All right, 1 second. All right, so now we'll be going over functions. You guys have actually already come across some functions in your coding. And that function is the main function. So I'll show you that right here. See how it says int main and then the parentheses? This is actually a function. And it's what we call the main function. So functions are basically just used to perform certain actions, help with efficiency when you want to like perform a section of code multiple times, but at different times. Because you know how with loops you can do the same thing multiple times in a row. With functions you can call things at different periods of time. You can sort of think of it as like breaking your code into sections that the computer can run, separately whenever you call it. So yeah. So one of the biggest or most important things about functions is creating and calling them. So the first function that I'll be showing you guys about or teaching about is the void function. And basically, my name is the name of the function, similar to how like in the main function, it's called main. So right here we have my function, and then we follow it with 2 parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we'll put some stuff, but that will be on the next slide. So you start by saying void, in this case, and then we will put the name of the function right here, and then we have parentheses, and then we just put some brackets, similar to how we'd be doing our if statements and our loops. And then right in between the brackets is your code that you want to run. So I'll begin by showing you guys the void function. And the void functions are basically just functions that don't return a value. So it might just say things, but it's essentially not returning any values to the main function. And then, so this is how you create your function. And you'll create your function above the main function, but below the header. So in our code, that would look something like right here. This is where you would put your function. This is your header, and this is your main. So our function goes right in the middle. And then to call our function, we'll say the name of the function, parentheses, and then a semicolon. All right, so let's look at this like in actual code. We created our function, and the function basically just says, I just ran. And this is our main stuff. We called our function by saying the name of the function, semicolons, or parentheses, and then the semicolon. And then if we run this, the code would output, I just ran. Because basically what functions are doing is it's taking the stuff you put up here and then running it in the main function. This is how you're running it. So whatever you've gotten here, it says output this phrase. It'll do that in here. Sorry, one second. Yes, I can go back one second. And I actually put the slides on Google Classroom like 30 minutes ago. So if you want to take a look at the slides as we're doing stuff, you could totally just look on there. All right, so someone has a great question. What if you don't create the function outside of the main function? It basically just won't work. So functions need to be created outside of the main function, and there are 2 ways you can do that. You can put it above the main function, like we're doing up here, or you can put it below the main function. We'll generally put it above the main function simply because it's just a little bit easier. Like there's one step that you don't have to do. If you put it above the main function, you don't have to initialize it above the main function. Or if you put it below the main function, then you don't have to do stuff above the main function. Sorry, that was probably so confusing. But basically, yes, you have to do them outside of the main function, create them outside of the main function, but then you have to call them inside the main function, since that's where we're actually running our code. Okay, so the next thing with functions is parameters. So if you see right here, we don't actually have anything in these parentheses. We're just outputting code. but we can add something called parameters to make our functions a little bit more complex by basically just adding variables to our functions. Parameters are basically just variables, but since they're inside the function and not the main, we call them parameters. So you can separate your parameters with a comma, and you can use as many as you want. You can use 0 as the previous slide showed, or you can do like 5, 10. That might be a little excessive, and chances are you could just split that into smaller functions or multiple functions, but you could totally do that if you want to. So now we've upgraded from this function of void function name semicolon or parentheses to void function name parameters and then our code. So let's see how that looks. In this example, we're getting like the information of some pets. So I decided to name the function pet info. And then we have two parameters. The name of the pet, so I called it string because it's a name or a word, and then name, and the age of the pet. So double, since like dogs and cats, you're often doing decimals, and then age. And then I want it to output the name of the pet, so I said pet name, and then it's going to output the name right here because that variable. So that's how sort of the variables translate between the main and the function. So they pretty much act the same, the parameters and the variables. And then right here, I'm going to get the pet age. I'm going to output that, and so I just use the variable age. So then in the main function, we call these the functions that we created. So by calling it, I'll start with the name of the function, so pet info, and I'll do the parentheses, and then I have to list my parameters. So in this case, since our first parameter is a string, I have to put a string in the first spot. And remember, strings use quotation marks. So I'm writing a word with quotation marks around it. Then you do a comma, and then you list the second parameter. So in this case, it's age, and it's a double, so I'm putting a number. And then I do that multiple times because I had 3 different animals. And then it'll output the information of these 3 different animals based off of what I put in here. And so as you can see, this is a lot easier to just call the function multiple times than to maybe copy and paste this stuff into the main function, however many times you want to do it. So this is just a way to streamline your code, make it a little bit easier to read, but then also easier to use. So as you can see, I put snow, 3. So then it outputs pet name, and then whatever the name, it said name here, it's going to take this name snow and put it up there. And we get pet name, snow. Pet age, it's going to take that age and say 3. So basically, the order of your parameters matters a lot because it's taking whatever order you put them in and then displaying them like that in your actual code. So let's try this out. I know you guys have just been introduced to functions, but I'd like you to start by creating a function that says hello world. And I'll do this with you on the side right here. So, thanks. Sorry, I think I gotta escape. Okay. All right, so as I'm figuring this out, you can start by creating the function. So since we're just displaying the message, we're going to use a void function. So I'd like you to start by writing void and then name your function. And remember, we're declaring or creating our function above the main area. So like in this case, string. We're going to create our function. So I'm going to say void, and I'm going to name my function like, and we're going to do our parentheses. And since we're just displaying something, we don't actually need any parameters. So I'm going to say void greet as our function name, two parentheses, and then we're going to do our brackets. And so then to say hello world, it's just like when we regularly code, we'll just say cout, and then hello world. So hopefully everyone got there. We basically just created a function right above the main. Make sure it's above the main. Now we're going to call our function inside the main. So we're going to say greet, because that's the name of our function, and then parentheses and a semicolon. That should call it. So let's run this and see what happens. And it outputted our message, hello world. Let me know if you were having trouble with that, like if it wasn't working, or if you have any questions about functions. I'd like you guys to try the second one. This might be a bit of a challenge, but I'd like you to create a function that says hello, and then the user's name. So in this case, we will need a parameter because we need to get the name of the user. So you gotta put something in these parentheses. Maybe string name. This is gonna change. So now if we want to get the user's name, we're going to start by saying cout, because we got to display hello. We're going to say hello, comma, and then just like when we're regularly coding, we're going to take whatever variable we want. In this case, our variable is name. We're just going to call it a parameter instead of a variable because it's our function. So we're going to say hello, and then just name, because that's what our parameter is. All right, so now we've got that. All right, let's run this and see what happens. Oh no, we got an error. So I created this function, I said greet, and then I put one parameter. So then why isn't it running? I made a mistake in calling it. Since there is one parameter up here, you gotta put one variable here to match it. And that's really important. So if you've got one here, you gotta put one variable in here. If you have two, you gotta put two variables in here. So we're gonna create a variable. We can just call it, we could just call it name again. That's totally fine. So I'll say greet name. And this might feel a little weird to you guys because as you know, you don't want to use the same variable name twice. Like that's just going to mess everything up. But since this is in a different function, you can use the same variable name again. So I'm going to say string name. So that's I'm declaring my variable. Here I'm saying greet and the name. Here I'm running my function. So let's see what happens. Oh no, it didn't let me enter a name. So let's get the name from the user. Enter name. And I'd just like to remind you guys, I know that a lot of you aren't on computers, so sometimes the \n for a new line is difficult. You can also just do end and then a letter L for end line. And then we're gonna the user's name. Now let's try this. I'm gonna enter. And now it says hello and then my name. So this is a really cool way to use functions. I know that you guys can do this just in the main, so this might feel a little bit redundant, but functions are just an easy way to break up your code and make it a little bit more manageable. And we'll see that a little bit later. So, oh, I see questions. Yes, I will put it in the chat. Okay, does anyone have any questions before I move on? We'll have a little bit more function practice. We'll just learn about a couple different types of functions. All right, so as I said earlier, this function is we put the word void in front of our function name because this function isn't giving us a value. And that might have made no sense to you earlier. But hopefully you see that like we're just displaying something. We're not actually doing anything with like a number. We're not returning it in the main and like doing more with it. So let's see what we do if we want to return our values. So in this case, we have a different function. Notice how instead of void, we're putting the word int in front of the function. So for example, in this case, it's int add, and then we put one parameter in there. So in this case, it's saying int add return 5 plus x. So this is also different. We're having the word return instead of, or that's just new. We didn't have the word return before. And return basically means that it's going to sort of self-explanatory, but like deliver or save the value, whatever you say it should return. So we're saying int, we're telling it to add, and this is our parameter. And then it's going to return 5 plus whatever our parameter is. So say we have 3 as our number, then it's going to take 3, add it to 5, and then we said cout, so it's going to output 3 plus 5, which is 8. So you can sort of take a look at that and familiarize yourself with what's a little bit different. Instead of void, we're doing int, or any type of data types. You could say string, say char, and then we're also returning a value. Sorry, 1 second. All right. You can also do the same thing, returning your values with multiple parameters. So you could say something like int x and int y. And we want to return the sum of those two numbers. And so then in the main function, you can take this or what function you had created, and you put the different numbers in for your parameters. So in this case, 5 and 3. We're going to do 5 plus 3 because that's what's being returned. And you can store that in a different variable. So in this case, they created a variable called z, and then they stored the result of this function. So because this function is taking 5 and 3 and then adding them, z should equal 8. Because it's basically just outputting, or z is whatever the output of the function is. So let's try that but with multiplication. So we're going to create a function that returns the product of two values. So product is, remember, multiplying 4 and 8. So I'll keep this up, or you could just do 5 and 3. I think that'd be fine. Maybe try this, but try to figure out how we can do this by multiplying two values instead. Maybe change the name of your function from my function to something that's a little appropriate, maybe multiply or product. So I'd like to give you a couple minutes to try this. Instead of adding, multiply the numbers 5 and 3. And when you're done, I'd like it if you put your code in the chat. You could just direct message it to me. All right, if you did finish, I'd like it if you put it in the chat, but I'll just start showing you guys how to do it. Oops. Right, so we'll multiply, return the value, or multiply for the values 5 and 3. So we're going to go, I'm not going to create a void function. Instead, we're going to do an int. We can just call it product. And I'm going to call them int x and int y. Those are our two parameters, since we're just multiplying two numbers. And then what I'm going to do is we want to return the product. So we're going to do x times y, and just a semicolon. Now this is our main function. So in our main function, we want to call our other function in our product function. So I'm going to say product, and I'm just going to do the numbers 5 and 3. And say, and so what you can do is you could just, so there's two ways to go about this. I'll show you both ways. The first way is you could just say cout and then the product, or you can store it in a separate integer or a separate value. So you could say something like int z, like we did in the example, and then z equals the product. So this should display the number 15 two times. Or no. Let me see. Let's see. All right, now it should display the number 15 twice. And there you go, 15 and 15. So there's two ways to go about this, but the biggest thing is when you're returning a value, it's going to put the number in, it's going to return the value to this function, but that's not going to do anything if you don't like output it or something. And I think the easiest way would be to store it in a new variable, and we'll discuss that a little bit next. But you could also just say cout. All right, then I'll go back to this. And let me know if you have any questions. All right. And so we'll just skip this for now, and I'll put this, you could just try this as homework if you wanted to. The next thing I'd like us to try is turning this bank account code into functions. I think this would be a really easy way to, or a fun way to try out some functions. I'll put it in the chat, just one second. And I'll leave both ways there, both ways to output it. And you can sort of pick what's best, but I really do think storing it in a different variable, like I did with z here, is better for like the long run. All right, so now I've created some bank account code. If you guys remember, we were doing this a little bit earlier with the if-else statements. So I'd like you all to create a new project and then put this code into there. And I'll do this with you. So I created this bank account code with loops and if-else statements. So it's pretty big, very long. And so I'd like you guys to try and condense it into functions, make it a little bit easier to read and easier to manage. So let's put that right here. You can see this is very long. So first I'll just go over what it all means, because it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. So welcome to your bank account. you can do 3 different actions. You can deposit money, so add money, withdraw money, or subtract money, and then just check your bank account balance. And if you enter Q, you can quit the program. And right now I've set the bank account balance to be $500. So what I've done is I first created a do-while loop. If you guys remember, a do-while loop is basically just like a little bit of an alteration to the regular while loop. Instead of checking the condition and then running it, it first does everything once, and then it checks for the condition. So I've had it do everything once, and then check if the user's action is Q, or does not equal Q, because I want this to keep going while it does not equal Q. As soon as it equals Q, I want it to quit, and then to return 0 means it'll just stop the program. So that's why I created this do-while loop. So inside the do-while loop, we've got a few things going on. And first, just to clarify, character action is basically just what the user is going to do. So deposit, D, withdraw, W, C, check account balance, and Q is quit. So I start by asking them to select an action on one of those, and then we get that action. So if the action is D, I'll ask them how much they want to deposit, we'll get that amount, and then we'll update the balance. So we'll say the balance, which was 500, is now 500 plus whatever the amount they wanted to deposit. So we're increasing their balance, and then I'm displaying the current balance. But if the action is W, we'll have them withdraw. So same thing, but instead we're going to subtract the balance amount. But as you guys remember earlier, hopefully you remember, if the balance, or if the amount that they want to withdraw is greater than their balance, then we don't want them withdrawing, because then they're going to have a negative account balance. So say I have $500 and I want to withdraw $600, that's not okay for our bank account. So in this case, I'm saying if the balance is minus the amount is greater than 0, or basically you could just rearrange this and say if the balance is greater than the amount, then I want you to calculate and display the balance and subtract.
Wait, can't the balance minus amount be greater than or equal to 0?
That's true. I'll change that. That's a great correction. Thank you, Aaron. So everyone can update that actually. Right here, greater than or equal to 0. And so, yep, then we're gonna create a new balance and then display that new balance. Otherwise, I'm just going to say you don't have enough money, and then we're going to display that old balance that they had. If the action is C, then I just want it to display the current balance. Otherwise, I want them to say that action is not supported. And this will just keep going while the action does not equal Q. As soon as they say Q, it'll stop the program. But as you can see, this is very long. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and condense this into a little bit of a more manageable thing by using functions. So as you guys remember, hopefully we're doing functions below the header. This is our header, and I can actually comment that. If you forgot, comment is just 2 forward slashes, but above the main. So right here, I'll put my function. All right, so the first function that I would like to create is for our deposit action. As you can see, this is a lot to deposit. This is a lot of work just to create a deposit. So let's start by creating a deposit function. And I'd really like you guys to pay attention to this because I'm going to do the deposit one, and then I'd like you to try doing the withdraw and the check balance on your own. So let's start with deposit. All right, so first, deposit, since it's an amount in dollars, I'd like it to be a double. And we'll be returning the balance, so this will not be a void function. Instead, we'll call it double, because we're returning the double. I'm just going to call it deposit, and then parentheses. All right, so what values do we need? In here, we have our action value, we have our amount, and we have our balance. So I was thinking of putting the function in place of this. So we can leave the action value as is, and we only have to deal with the amount and the balance. So those will be my two variables. I'll call it double amount and double balance. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this code into the function, and then we can figure out what to do with it from there. All right, so first I'm going to ask them, how much do you want to deposit? We're going to get that amount. Then I want to calculate the balance. And then here it's going to display the balance. So first of all, since this is a double and I'm not doing void, I got to return it. So we want to return balance. And what I've noticed is I keep saying the current balance. I think I say this like 4 different times, right? It's very repetitive. I think we could turn that into a separate function. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy this. And we'll make that a different function. We can just call that void. And then we'll say, sorry, I don't remember where I did this earlier. Okay, void, and then we could just call this DisplayBalance. And then balance is double. Balance. And it'll just output the balance. All right, so now we have our deposit function and we have our DisplayBalance function. So now let's try and use them in the actual code. So first we have our deposit. I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to delete this stuff, and instead I'm going to call our function. So deposit, and then the 2 parameters. So the parameters here were amount and balance. So I can just use the amount and balance I've got here, make sure the order is correct, and then I'll put a semicolon. So now I've called my deposit function. Right. And now we got to display the current balance. So I'm going to display balance using my DisplayBalance function. And again, we have 1 parameter, and that's balance. All right, so let's try this and see what happens. All right, so I'm going to select D to deposit. How much would you like to deposit? Let's say I want to deposit $90. Oh no, it didn't update my current balance. Does anyone know why? So right here, I called the deposit function, but I forgot to actually have it output anything. So what we could do is we could say, oops, sorry, that didn't make sense. So we are having it output the balance right here, right? But it's not actually updating the balance. What it's doing is it's returning the value balance, but this value balance isn't going anywhere. So what we need to do is we need to say that this balance equals whatever you return from here. Otherwise, that value is just floating in space. Here we're saying it's actually equal to something. Then it will update. So let's run that again. As you can see, if I want to deposit, $50, it updates the current balance from 500 to 550. So if you guys were just sort of following along and you didn't get this on yours, I can put this in the chat right now. Yeah, 1 second. Oh, did I change? I think I might have changed this before I put it on the Google slide. So you might just want to use the code I put in the chat. But as you can see, this is sort of how we streamlined it from this big chunky code to just 2 simple functions. So I think the next thing that I'd like you to do, because we just got like 4 minutes left, is try and take, you can skip the withdraw one for now. It'll still work if you don't switch it to a function. And try and change the check balance to a function. So this is just taking this line and turning it into a function. Now I already created the function, so all you have to do is call it. And if you figure that out, feel free to put it in the chat. And if you do that, you can move on to the withdraw one. I know that's a little bit more tricky. I'll put my solution to that on Google Classroom tonight if you want to check that out. But before the end of class, I'd like it if you just sent me, you could just copy and paste this section, but delete this and instead call a function. And then just put that in the chat so I can check it. Oh, I'm sorry. It looks like the code didn't copy all the way. So what I'm going to do is, I think it stopped balance minus amount and then see out current balance. What I'll do is I'll just quickly put this in like Google Doc and share the link with you guys. And then you can copy and paste it from there. All right. Sorry, I didn't realize it didn't copy all the way. So I'll share the link right now. I know we only have like a minute left, so if you were able to figure that out, that's great. If you weren't, then I totally understand. I'll maybe look at it tonight, and I'll put my solution to. It's not sharing. Okay. I'll put my solution to it on the Google Classroom. And we also didn't get to pass by reference, which isn't super important, so that's okay. If you are interested in it, you can look at it on the slides and let me know if you have any questions. All right, let's see if it loads. I'll also put this on the Google Classroom. All right, got the link. I'll just share this with everyone. Oops, never mind, that one did not work. Share, copy link. All right, there you go. Hopefully that works, and you can sort of check that out, play with it, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions. See you.